Tom, thank you for coming on the program. We have been friends for a number of years, having gone to high school together, and now reunited in a way at the University of Toledo, where we are able to work together. And I think that it's good to have the chance to talk to you about economic matters, because it's a field that theologians don't often dabble in. It seems important for us to be able to talk as sort of a model of what has to happen generally. That is, a conversation between theologians and people who are more interested in the business world and have training in economics and so on. Are you up to such a discussion?
By all means. I think the notion of sharing ideas from different perspectives, business professor, if you like, versus theologian, if versus is the right word, is a very attractive way to arrive at some mutual understanding and maybe to share some of that.
It'll be interesting to see if it is versus, Tom. Maybe we'll get some differences of opinion going here. But theology really has always thought that it had to enrich itself by dialoguing with other disciplines. Theologians really can't just take the scriptures and the church teaching and try to say it to the people. Theologians have to be learning from the culture, have to be in touch with what's going on. And traditionally, theology's done a good job of dialoguing with philosophy. We think of Augustine dealing with Plato's thought, and Thomas Aquinas dealing with Aristotle, and Karl Rahner today dealing with the thought of existential philosophy. So that has generally happened. And in this century, we've done a pretty fair job of dialoguing with psychologists. The Freudian Revolution has forced us to rethink many things. We have learned a lot from the humanistic psychologists and so on. And we've even done a bit of dialogue with the sociologists. Gregory Baum's work along that line is very important, where he studied sociology and has read the great humanistic sociologists and tried to see what they might have to say about making the Christian message relevant. But when you look at economics, there is really a blank. If you try to find some good works, for example, by theologians on the economic world, you don't find many of those. The idea of dialogue between the economic world is somehow been foreign to theology. Maybe we've not done it because it has to do with money and all those mundane kind of things. Maybe we haven't realized the importance of the economic system in terms of shaping our outlook and so on. But finally, in our own time, in the last decade and so, we begin to see more of this dialogue going on. And we see that in the work of the liberation theologians, for example, using Marxist categories to deal with the realities in Latin and South America. So we have a literature there. But not a whole lot when we begin to look at the capitalistic system, or an analysis of what goes on here in the United States. So maybe we could begin to talk a little bit along that line.
Well, you do have, of course, the papal encyclicals going back into the latter part of the 19th century, dealing with social justice in what must be regarded as a capitalistic context. But I think you're right.
Yeah, that's done more by the religious leaders and performing sort of a prophetic role in trying to champion the rights of the working person, for example. And that's a very important contribution, you're right, and I don't want to play that down. That's a little different, however, from finding theological analyses of what is going on and a real dialogue. I mean, not many people would say that the papal encyclicals show a lot of dialogue, I don't think, with the scientific world of economics and so on. There is strong use of the scriptures and of the tradition to champion the rights of the marginalized and the oppressed, for example, and a lot of comments, perhaps vague, some people would say, on how the systems ought to work, and critiques in general. But the kind of thing where we would find a theologian really knowing the language of the economists and entering into that world, I think, are not so forthcoming. Tom, when I'm thinking about what we need to do, there's a number of different procedures, it seems. First, the theologian would have to begin to learn the language a little bit of the field. In other words, you'd have to know something of what we mean by supply-side economics, or Reaganomics, or of supply and demand, or of the wage system, and how the system works in general. I think we would have to begin to learn that, and I'm afraid not many theologians really are in touch with all of that. But another area that we would have to work at, and one that I'd like to talk a little bit about here, is to begin to compare the systems that are available, the economic systems, to, for example, to look at communism or democratic socialism or democratic capitalism, or what we might consider a more Christian kind of view of how we might organize ourselves economically, and to begin to make some comparisons after we understand what those systems mean. So why don't we start out just by looking a little bit at the capitalistic system and trying to compare it with the socialistic systems that are available. And as soon as I introduce those words, we got a problem right away, because we don't understand a lot of what capitalism means and socialism means. So why don't you start and say a little bit about that?
Well, I think a couple major points I would make. If we are going to contrast socialism with capitalism, we have to recognize that there is a capitalism that was in the mind of Adam Smith in the 18th century, a fairly pure version of capitalism, and a practical version of capitalism that exists in 1982 in the United States of America and Japan and most Western European countries to a greater extent. There's a difference, in other words, between this distilled blueprint version and what actually is working or in operation in contemporary society. The same is true of socialism, of course. The socialism of Karl Marx was a pure version with a lot of intellectual and philosophical dimensions to it that were not carefully worked out in the concrete, yet what we see in the socialistic countries of the communist world or of Scandinavia or in some of the Latin American and Asian countries is a practical, concrete example. Both of the concrete examples, of course, of capitalism and of socialism carry with them many elements of the other. There are capitalistic elements, if you like to call them that, in modern socialisms, and elements of socialism in modern capitalistic countries. The other point that I think is worth remembering is that if we go back to these architects, to Smith and to Marx, they were writing out of a tradition of reaction or response or criticism to excesses or ills of the systems that they saw in their time. Smith in the 18th century is really reacting to or criticizing the mercantilist, autocratic system of the monarchy of certainly England primarily, or Great Britain. And Marx is writing against somewhat the same kind of thing 100 years later, or not quite 100 years later. What he saw were ills or diseases of capitalism as it existed in the middle of the 19th century. So oftentimes what we get is a pure, abstract, exaggerated view in response to ills, and when those systems actually work themselves out in contemporary experience, they're not quite so pure or so distilled.
Tom, when we would look at some of the characteristics of these systems, I would like to think of it as sort of a continuum in which we would see at one end of the spectrum a total capitalist laissez-faire system in which all the means of production would be in the hands of either individuals or in the hands of corporations. And at the other end of the spectrum would be a total socialist system in which the means of production would be in the hands of the state, in which we would have a planned economy, and that all of that would be almost totally controlled. Now, I don't suppose anywhere in the world we have total pure systems like that, but we could probably take any country and sort of place it in that scale. So if we looked at the United States, for example, we'd say, well, it leans closer to the capitalistic style, where we have government running certain things, but we also have private ownership of small companies, and we have the gigantic corporations and so on, which control the factories, the means of production, and so on. And then what would be a good example at the other level? Surely we'd get someplace like communist China, where you have it seems like almost a totally planned economy and a state-run economy and so on. I understand there's a few sort of more capitalistic elements being introduced now, but that would be an example, right, of a country that's at the other end of the spectrum.
Sure, and of course, As you and I have talked before, I think you need to recognize, even at the ends of that spectrum, the distinction between entrepreneurial capitalism, largely envisioned by Smith and exhibited or reflected today in most small businesses, as opposed to large corporations, and at the other end, the distinction between although government-owned enterprises which are largely independent and functioning in a market kind of context, as opposed to those where the business enterprise really is an instrument of the state, is not only owned by the government or by the public, but actually is used to foster political ends. What's happening in the Middle East, in Iran today, is a dramatic example where the businesses are really the major businesses that are controlled by the government of Iran are really viewed as fostering whatever the political ends of the state are, not simply providing railroad service or air service or oil in a essentially market context, but where the dividends are paid to the public as opposed to individuals who own the stock, but as I say, actually are political institutions rather than economic institutions.
Tom, if we could take another characteristic where we would try to straighten out our understanding here of capitalism and socialism, would it not have to do with the whole idea of surplus? That one of the notions in the capitalistic society is that you invest your money, and that for your investment you get a return, and you pay your wages and so on, and out of that then there's supposed to be a surplus left over that in turn gets invested in order to expand the means of production and to create new industries and so on. I think, isn't that, again, one of the classic ways that capitalism is supposed to work? So that the picture I keep getting when I read the literature is then of an expanding pie, that the capitalists want to think that the pie isn't so big and you can only cut certain amounts out of it, but that the economy somehow can keep expanding, or that the growth rate is important to keeping the economy healthy. So that, and you can only do this if you've got the surplus after you've paid your wages and expenses and so on, so it can be reinvested somehow.
Well, this is this can be a very complicated notion in economic theory. Let me make a couple of, I hope, simple points that at least highlight the problem. The notion of profit in contemporary economic and financial theory is viewed as the cost of capital. In other words, it's the price that gets people to invest. Absent that price, you and I would not buy a share of stock or start a business. In other words, we expect some return, and that's why we make that investment. And if we didn't make that investment, we would do something else with our money or with our labor or with our time and talent. We might buy a savings account or a CD in a bank, or we might put it in the ground, or we might go off and play the guitar for our own enjoyment. So that's the incentive side of it. The other notion that has to do with the market system, of course, is that through exchange, aggregate value, the value of the total output, is increased. You and I might exchange in a market setting. You and I might exchange dollars for goods. The reason why we do that is because we see in that exchange that both of us will be better off, and in fact we are. That's only logical or rational. If I didn't think I would be getting more for my dollar through buying goods, or you getting more value through the exchange of goods for money, then you wouldn't do it, obviously. So it's in those two notions, I think, that you see the total value or the concept of progress or surplus being created. Now, the question is, how does that surplus occur in a socialist system?
Michael, first of all, am I correct in ascribing to the capitalist idea that the expanding pie notion is generally part of it, as opposed to when I seem to read the democratic socialists that the pie seems more fixed, and there is the notion that if some people have more, others will have less, and that most of the writing out of the socialist tradition seems to to play down this idea of the expanding economy? I mean, is that generally correct, or am I off the mark?
Well, I think that's a fair assessment. Now, the early capitalist writing or the early traditional economic writing didn't pay too much attention to that question. I think Schumpeter in the early 40s, late 30s began to pay much more attention to the growth aspects of the economy under capitalism. I would have to say, I suppose, if one were to characterize Adam Smith, he was pretty much a zero-sum kind of person in a sense. The notion of technological progress really wasn't covered in early economic writings, even though it was occurring all around the economists who were writing at the time. I think it's also fair to say that to a large extent, modern socialist thought raises the question of, or assumes that we have a finite universe, and that in that finite universe, capitalism tends to exploit, tends to create disequilibria, tends to create inequalities that socialism addresses. The point is that modern socialist thought assumes this fixity in the size of the pie, and thus says, well, if we've got a fixed size pie, then we ought to share it equally, and socialism does that better than capitalism.
There are presuppositions, aren't there, in these two different systems, if we can take the model for each one. The capitalistic system, I think, assumes somehow that human nature is out of kilter, that people are going to act out of self-interest, whatever you try to do to them as a governmental structure or as a moral system, that people are going to act out of self-interest, but that you can turn that to advantage in the capitalistic system, so that you can say that people will act to get more money for their families, to make a higher standard of living for themselves and their loved ones, and that by doing that, they will somehow produce more goods, buy a business, produce something that will help other people. And that I think that, therefore, the question of equality isn't so important. In capitalism, it seems like there's more of a sense, well, there won't be equality because some people have more talent, they'll get ahead, they'll make more money, but somehow that's all right because that's going to benefit others. I take it that that's a lot of what supply-side economics says, that if we can get the people with a lot of money to have more to invest, they will invest it, and somehow that is going to end up helping people all the way down the line. Now, I think that, as I read the socialist literature, it seems very different, because here the real concern is to avoid the inequalities and to say it's not right for some people to have all this money and wealth and for other people to be very poor. That the big question is distribution and finding equality and not allowing people to have a lot more, so that everyone can have something and have subsistence levels at least.
Well, at the practical level, of course, both kinds of systems try to strike balances. I suppose in the capitalistic system we're much more tolerant of a few very wealthy people, and you say supply-side economics tries to sort of take social advantage of those pools of wealth, whether they exist in individuals or in corporations, by taking away the inhibitions against risk-taking and investment. The notion being, of course, if risks are taken, investments are made in more productive kinds of technologies, that the entire society will be better off, and that if those investments are not made, if people simply sit on their money or consume their money, which is the other balance, of course, is the production versus consumption question, that wealthy people will simply go out and buy Cadillacs and mink coats instead of taking their marginal dollars and investing them in enterprise in hope of growth.
You know that the religious tradition has entered into this debate at a number of different levels. You know, it's often been said that all of the theologians of the 19th and 20th century have really been socialists. Paul Tillich said that a Christian has to be a socialist, and that in some ways the capitalistic system is demonic. I think that this grows out of the religious concern for the oppressed and the poor and the fact that so many people seem to end up getting hurt in the capitalistic system. I might point out a counterpoint to that in the official Catholic kind of literature and the encyclicals of the Pope since 1891. There's been opposite kind of statements. In fact, I think it was Pius XI who said that you couldn't be a Christian and a socialist. So I guess what I'm pointing out is that within the religious tradition, you really have an ambivalence. You have some people taking the view that, and especially the theologians seem to move in that direction of saying, tending much more to socialism. The number of prominent theologians in the United States are members of Michael Harrington's organization, for example, Democratic Socialists. And whereas the leadership, at least in the Catholic community, has not been so open to the socialism, although since Pope John the 23rd and the Christian Marxist dialogue, we have seen a much greater openness to Christians being aligned with socialists, and even a Marxist-type Christian analysis of the culture, especially in Latin and South America.
Well, I think in economic philosophy you see a division, or I see a division between those who look to aggregate economic growth or aggregate economic productivity as the principal goal of the system, and those who are much more concerned about a fair and equitable distribution of income or wealth in the society.
Do you find the same division among economists?
Yes, and I think it's fair to say that what we might call a theological mindset probably is less concerned with aggregate economic welfare and is more concerned with the distribution. The problem is, you and I have talked before, I think, is that, well, Novak makes the point, of course, that inequality is inherent in every system for a variety of reasons, and I guess we don't really need to go into that. But that when you have equality, at least according to some decision or some definition, there tends to be an inhibition of aggregate economic productivity because you take away much of the incentive for individual productivity, and ultimately aggregate productivity is simply the result of individual productivity, perhaps multiplied through cooperative efforts, but ultimately individuals have to be involved in it.
Tom, can that be put this simply to say that private farmers seem to produce more than collective farms do? Is that a way of saying that?
Well, I think the evidence is there.
Exemplifying your point?
I think the evidence is there that happens. I'm not...
You own your own plot of land, you're going to work harder on it, you're going to find out how to produce more, you're part of a collective, and somehow you don't work as hard and it doesn't produce as much.
There tends to be fewer penalties for non-participation in the collective system, and fewer rewards for effective participation. The other thing that's kind of interesting in the case histories of collective farming, of course, is that oftentimes, depending on the management of those collective farms, what happens is that the individuals figure out how to take what is the collective product of the farm and turn it to their own purpose.
Mm-hmm. Tom, I'd like to get a bit in here about, the Christian viewpoint of a system. You know that the current Pope, John Paul II, has been very critical both of capitalism and of socialism, and I think he has spoken well on this, criticizing the materialism and consumerism in our own culture, and especially the lack of freedom in the socialist systems that we know in the world, the actual workings of them, not the ideal of socialism, but actual socialist countries, as he knew in his own country of Poland, and as we see such a terrible degree these days with army people taking care of working people, a real difficult problem for Marxists to deal with. But so there's this critique of capitalism and socialism, but the question is, what are we putting forth in a positive way? And I'm not sure that we have a complete system in mind, but there's certain principles that we like to get out there. And that one is that the importance of human rights and human dignity, that people have a right to a fair wage and proper shelter and so on, and that indeed the exercise of private rights, owning of private property and so on, somehow has to be for the common good. There'd be a couple ideas that I think ought to be in any kind of just structure.
Well, I think you have that pretty well, in what we might call an idealized capitalistic society. Not necessarily the pure one now of Adam Smith, but the one that we might say we'll take the system we have today, recognize its faults, and try to correct them, and say, yes, we would pay just wages to people.
Tom, we're going to run out of time, unfortunately. So much more I know you want to say right now, but we've been trying to do some sort of comparison of capitalism and socialism, and we've seen some of the ideas, perhaps the genius of the capitalistic system to try to turn self-interest into benefit for the common good, and the socialist idea of equality, and what I would like to get out in the record, the Christian idea of trying to make sure we defend the rights and the dignity of all human beings.